Sit down and listen well, because what I am about to tell you is not something the wind carries lightly. It happened in the village of Euphoma, where the red earth was so old it remembered the footsteps of our grandfathers' grandfathers. The people there were farmers and fishermen, proud and strong. They knew their gods by name and they knew their rules. One rule sat heavier than the rest. A child who speaks to the air, to the trees, to things no living person can see. That child is a warning. So when a baby girl was born on the night the river flooded its banks and swallowed 3 canoes whole, the old women covered their mouths. They did not cheer. They did not sing the welcome songs. They only looked at each other with eyes full of something cold. This child came into the world already talking, not crying, talking, and nobody understood a single word. Her mother's name was Nkemchi. She was a quiet woman who loved her husband more than she loved sleep or food. Her husband, Odian, was a strong man with a big laugh, the kind that made goats lift their heads and look around. They had waited 6 years for a child. 6 long, painful years. When Nkemchi felt the baby move for the first time, she pressed Odian's hand to her belly and laughed until she cried. This child was wanted. This child was prayed for. But the night the baby came, Odian sat outside the hut and listened to sounds he could not explain. His wife's cries, yes. The midwife's firm voice, yes. But also something else. A low murmur, steady and strange, like a second voice inside the room. When the midwife opened the door, her face had lost its color. "Your daughter is here," she whispered. But Odian, she was speaking before she drew breath. They named her Oriva. It meant God knows. And Nkemchi chose it because she did not know what else to say. The first weeks were peaceful enough. Oriva fed well. She slept. Her eyes, dark and wide, followed shadows on the ceiling with a stillness that made visitors feel watched. The trouble began when she was 3 months old. Nkemchi walked into the room and found Oriva on her mat, arms stretched toward an empty corner, fingers moving slowly, her lips forming sounds that had no shape Nkemchi had ever heard. Nkemchi called out. Oriva did not look at her. She kept her eyes fixed on that corner and kept speaking in that low, wet voice, like someone deep in conversation. Nkemchi grabbed the child and pressed her to her chest. When she looked up, the corner was still empty. But the air there felt different, heavier, like breath on cold skin. Nkemchi told herself it was nothing. But silence is a thin cloth. Tears. By the time Oriva was 8 months old, 3 neighbors had seen things they could not explain. Old Mama Uche saw the baby wave at the space above the cooking fire, and the fire bent slowly like it was bowing back. A young girl came to borrow pepper and found Oriva sitting upright alone, pointing at the doorway, babbling sharply, as though scolding someone who had arrived without knocking. And Odian himself, one quiet evening, heard his daughter laugh, not a baby's bubble but a full, responding laugh, at something standing in the doorway that cast no shadow. He said nothing to Nkemchi that night. He lay on his mat with his eyes open and his heart knocking against his ribs like a fist on a locked door. The village had eyes everywhere. And eyes always find a mouth to feed. Word moved through Euphoma the way fire moves through dry grass. Fast, hungry, without asking permission. By the time Oriva turned 1 year old, half the village had a story. Some were true. Some were stretched into shapes the truth never intended. But they all ended the same way, with that baby girl and something that was not there. The Diakpa, the eldest man in the village, called a quiet meeting under the old Akpaka tree. 7 elders gathered with their walking sticks and their worry. A child who sees what others cannot, he said slowly, is either touched by the gods or claimed by something darker. We do not yet know which. One elder augily leaned forward. We must consult the Ifa before we decide anything. The others nodded. But the word had already spread further than the meeting. And not everyone was willing to wait for the Ifa to speak. Odian felt the change before he could name it. Men who used to drink palm wine with him at harvest now found reasons to leave early. Women who had laughed with Nkemchi at the river began choosing a different spot. Nobody said anything directly. Nobody is ever that honest when afraid. But the distance was there, wide and cold as the river in dry season. One morning Odeon went to the market and the seedling seller, a man he had known since boyhood, pushed the seedlings toward him quickly, took his money and looked away. That evening Odeon held Oriva in his lap. She was awake, her eyes bright and calm, studying his face. Then she lifted one small hand and pressed it to his cheek, speaking softly in her strange language. He did not know the words, but his eyes filled with tears. The tone he knew. It was comfort. The Ifa priest, a man called Baba Emir, lived at the edge of the village near the cotton tree that was older than any name anyone could remember. He was thin with patient eyes and hands that moved slowly, like a man who had decided nothing was worth rushing. Nkemchi carried Oriva to him on a Thursday morning, both of them quiet. Baba Emir did not greet them with words. He looked at the child for a long time. Then he said, "Put her down." Nkemchi unwrapped the cloth and set Oriva on the mat. The child looked up at Baba Emir. Then she looked at something beside him, something Nkemchi could not see, and smiled wide and warm as though greeting an old friend. Baba Emir's eyebrows rose. He reached for his divining tray and his palm nuts and began the work. The only other sound was Oriva, murmuring softly beside him, as though she and the unseen world were having their own quiet consultation. Baba Emir worked for the rest of the morning. He cast his nuts. He read his tray. He whispered prayers Nkemchi could not follow. When he finally sat back, his expression was serious in a way that made Nkemchi's hands go cold. "Your daughter carries a companion from the other side," he said. "Not an evil spirit. Not a curse." He paused and looked at the tray. "She carries an ancestor. A very old one who chose her before she was born. This ancestor speaks through her, guides her, watches the living through her eyes." Nkemchi pressed her hand to her mouth. "Is she safe?" Baba Emir looked at Oriva, who had fallen asleep on the mat, her small fingers curled like flower petals. "She is very safe," he said quietly. "The ancestor protects her fiercely." He met Nkemchi's eyes. "The question is whether the village will let them be." Nkemchi walked home slowly, Oriva tied to her back. She felt relief that it was not evil. She felt fear of what the village would do with this news. And underneath both feelings, one memory kept rising. Odeon's face when Oriva pressed her small hand to his cheek. The love in that tiny palm. That, at least, was not complicated. She had almost reached their compound when she heard it. Two women talking at the side of the path, their voices low but not low enough. "They went to the Ifa man today." "And what will the Ifa man say?" "He will say whatever Odeon pays him to say." The other woman clucked her tongue. "That baby is dangerous. A child that speaks to the dead brings the dead closer. They will not stop at one visit." Nkemchi walked past without turning her head. But her jaw was clenched so tight it ached for the rest of the day. Odeon received the news with a stillness that surprised Nkemchi. She expected him to argue or worry. Instead he sat quietly, watching Oriva on the mat, then said, "My grandfather always said some children come from far away. That the distance shows on them." He picked Oriva up. "She is still my daughter." But the village was not Odeon. The week after Nkemchi's visit to Baba Emir, someone hung bitter leaves tied with red thread on their gate. A warning. A sign that said, "We think your house is touched by something we do not want near us." Nkemchi pulled it down before Odeon saw. 2 days later another appeared. And then a stone was thrown through the window of their hut. No note, no name. Just the stone, and Oriva sitting up from sleep, looking calmly at the hole in the wall as though she had been told it was coming. The Diakpa called Odeon before the council. They called it a conversation, which was how the elders softened difficult things. 7 men sat in a half-circle under the akpaka tree. "We do not wish to punish you or your family," the Diakpa said. "But the village has fear. And fear, left without answer, becomes something worse." Odeon kept his voice steady. "Baba Emir has read the signs. The child is protected by an ancestor. She is not dangerous. One elder, Roland, who had converted to the church and worn his suspicion of old ways like a second skin, spoke sharply. A child in communion with the dead is not natural. Odeon looked at him for a long moment. Every man at this table has poured palm wine on the ground for his fathers, he said quietly. That is also communion with the dead. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. There was a woman in the village named Chioma. She was young, recently widowed, and her grief had curdled into something bitter. She started the story about the fish. She said that on the day Oriva was born, every fish in her net was dead before the net touched them. That the child had drained the life from the water. It was not true. Nkemchi knew it was not true. But the story spread, and once a story grows legs it runs faster than the truth. Chioma added to it week by week, the way a storyteller adds salt, slowly until everything tastes only of it. By the time Oriva was 14 months old, the tale had grown to include a dead bird on the path to their compound, a child who fell sick after visiting their yard, a strange light seen above their roof on the night of a new moon. None of it happened. All of it was believed. Nkemchi began to feel it in her body, the weight of being watched. She moved through the village carefully, like a person carrying water on their head on a windy day. All focus on not spilling. She kept Oriva indoors most afternoons. But one morning when the path to the river seemed clear, she took Oriva along. Halfway there Oriva stopped. She was barely 16 months, just learning her feet on uneven earth. But she stopped completely and looked left, into the tall grass beside the path. She pointed and spoke, fast and certain in her private language. Then she reached into the grass with her small hand. When she pulled it back, she held a carved wooden bangle, old and dark, the kind the old women used to wear. Nobody saw them go that way. Nobody could explain the bangle. But by evening, everyone in Euphoma had heard. And the explanation they chose was not wonder. It was terror. Odeon's brother, Emeka, came from the city to visit. He was a practical man who wore clean shirts and distrusted most things he could not measure. He arrived with biscuits for the baby and a settled, logical attitude. But Emeka sat with Oriva for only an hour before something shifted behind his eyes. She had been playing quietly with a small stone. Then she stopped, looked up at a space above the window, said something sharp and quick. And the stone in her hands grew warm. Emeka felt it when she placed it in his palm, warm and dry on a cool morning. He said nothing to Odeon about it. He sat through dinner with his practiced city face and talked about fuel prices and road conditions. But when he left the next morning, he held Odeon tight. "You need to leave this village," he whispered. "Afraid people do not wait long before they do something they cannot take back." Odeon watched his brother's car disappear into the dust. The thing that finally broke the fragile peace happened on a market day. Oriva was with Nkemchi in the square. She was easy in crowds, calm, wide-eyed, interested in everything. They were at the tomato seller's stall when Oriva tugged Nkemchi's wrapper and pointed hard at an old man sitting against the wall across the square. He was hunched and still, his breathing shallow. His name was Papa Ease. He had been ill for months, and his family had given up expecting him to last the year. Oriva would not be quieted. She pulled and pointed until Nkemchi, embarrassed and afraid, picked her up. That was when Oriva reached toward Papa Ease and said something long and clear and final sounding. Every person nearby turned. Papa Ease lifted his head. He looked straight at Oriva and began to cry. Quietly, peacefully, like a man who has received an answer he has been waiting for. He died 3 days later in his sleep. The village said Oriva had spoken the death over him. After that, Nkemchi stopped going to the market. She stopped going to the river. She sent Odeon for everything. When he came home his face told her things before his mouth did. Whose eyes followed him? Whose greetings were short? What new story had grown overnight? The elders met again. This time it was not called a conversation. Odeon was told plainly. The village had decided the child must be taken to the oracle. Not Baba Emir and his gentle mat. The true oracle. The one deep in the forest, 3 hours on foot, where the old power lived without apology. Odion came home and stood in the doorway looking at Nkemchi and Oriva before he could form the words. Nkemchi's face went white when she heard. "They want to take her to Igby," she said. Dian nodded. Igby was old and unpredictable. Igby asked for things. Sometimes the things Igby asked for could not be given back. Nkemchi stood up. "No," she said. Just that. That night, Nkemchi did not sleep. She lay on her mat and thought about her choices with the cold calm of a woman who has run out of time for fear. Oriva slept between her and Odion, her breathing slow and even, her fingers curled. Nkemchi watched her daughter's face in the thin moonlight. She thought about her own mother, a woman who had raised 4 children alone after her father left, a woman who had kept her family fed on stubbornness and prayer. Nkemchi was softer in some ways. But tonight she felt something harden inside her, clean and certain, like a bone setting back into place. She would not hand her daughter to any oracle, any elder, any village that had decided her child's strangeness was a debt they were owed. She reached out and touched Oriva's cheek. The baby's eyes opened immediately. Wait, knowing. And for the first time, Nkemchi smiled back without fear. She told Odion in the morning. He listened. His face did the complicated thing it always did when working through something hard. The slight furrow, the jaw shifting, the eyes looking at a wall and seeing something beyond it. When she finished, he said, "Where would we go?" Nkemchi had thought about this too. Her cousin Adiz lived in Wari. She was a schoolteacher. Practical, quiet. She had visited once and said nothing about Oriva except that she had beautiful eyes. That kind of nothing said everything. "Adiz," Nkemchi said. Odion was quiet for a while. He was thinking about his father's grave behind the compound where the aloe grew. About the fishing net his father had taught him to repair. About the smell of this earth, which was the smell of all his mornings. Then he said, "We will go quietly. We do not need to make it a story." And without ceremony, the decision was made. They told nobody. They packed what fit in 2 bags. Clothes, a few kitchen things, the small wooden box with Nkemchi's jewelry and the papers that said who they were. Odion went to the market under the pretense of buying pepper, and instead arranged a bus at the motor park. He came home and they ate their last dinner in that house quietly. Oriva between them, busy with a piece of dried fish. After she slept, Nkemchi and Odion sat outside under the stars without speaking. The night sounds of Euphoma surrounded them. Crickets, a distant dog, the river they could not see but always knew was there. Odion took Nkemchi's hand. "I am sorry," he said. "This was supposed to be the place." "It still is," Nkemchi said. "It always will be, inside us. But Oriva needs room." He squeezed her hand. The stars above Euphoma shone on everything beneath them without asking for explanation. They left before dawn. Oriva woke when they lifted her, looked around the dark hut with her calm eyes, and let herself be wrapped and carried. The road to the motor park was empty, just the 3 of them and the red earth pale in moonlight. They did not look back. The bus was old and packed with people and market goods, and a goat tied beneath the last seat. Oriva sat on Nkemchi's lap and watched the world through the scratched window with steady attention. 3 hours into the journey, she pressed her small hand flat against the glass and spoke. Not in her private language. In a voice still new and growing, clear Arobo words that Nkemchi could actually understand. She said, "Mama." Light. And there it was, ahead of them through the dirty glass, the first light of morning breaking over the tree line, orange and enormous, flooding everything. Nkemchi pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head and breathed. Wari received them without drama. Adiz was exactly as Nkemchi remembered. Efficient, warm in a practical way, asking no unnecessary questions. She had 2 rooms and gave them one. She cooked stew and put Oriva on her lap and said, "Well, she has clever eyes." That was all. In the weeks that followed, something in Nkemchi began to unknot. She slept through nights. She walked to the market without rehearsing her face. Odion found work at a construction site where a man cared only that you showed up and worked hard. Oriva moved through the small apartment observing everything, watching Adi's cat with deep scientific interest. She still spoke sometimes to the air, still paused in corners and pointed. But here nobody watched, nobody counted, nobody gathered under any tree to discuss what it meant. Here a strange child was only a child. And a mother who loved her strangeness was only a mother. Oriva turned 2 years old in that apartment, with a small candle on a piece of sweet bread. She blew it out without help and looked pleased with herself. Nkemchi cried a little in the kitchen, the kind that has relief in it more than sadness. What they did not know was that Euphoma had not forgotten them. The elders had sent word through a church network to a pastor in Wari who believed in spiritual warfare. He came one Wednesday morning with a Bible, anointing oil, and 2 deacons. He said he was there to pray for the child. He said it with the confident kindness of a man who does not believe refusal is an option. Adiz opened the door, looked at them and said, "She is not sick." He insisted. Adiz, whose voice could silence 30 children, stepped into the doorway. "I said," she repeated pleasantly, "she is not sick. Good morning." And she closed the door. But the pastor returned, and the second time Odion was home. The conversation at the door grew loud. The pastor said the child was communing with spirits. Odion said she was 2 years old and communed primarily with yam porridge and the neighbor's cat. The pastor said the village had concerns. Odion said the village had given up its right to be concerned. Nkemchi stood inside holding Oriva, who watched the raised voices with calm attention. Then Oriva stretched toward the door and began to speak, long and calm and steady in her language, as though translating. When she finished, she looked at Nkemchi, then said a single word. In a robo. It sounded like, "Done." The voices at the door slowed, then stopped. The pastor said something short and subdued. His footsteps moved away down the stairs. Odion came inside and stood still for a moment. Then he started to laugh. A year passed. Oriva grew quickly, the way children do when they are safe. She was walking and running and saying whole sentences by 3, weaving a robo and her other language together the way a basket weaver puts 2 kinds of reed together. Not something you question when it works. Adiz watched this small strange child who made the cat sit near her without being called, who pointed at rain before it arrived, who laughed sometimes at empty chairs. Adiz was not superstitious, but she was observant. One evening she told Nkemchi plainly, "Whatever she carries is not harmful. It is protective. When she speaks to the air, nothing goes wrong. It is only when no one listens that things go badly." Nkemchi sat still for a long time. Because Adiz was right. Every incident in Euphoma that people had called ominous, the stone warmed, the bangle found, the words to Papa ease, none caused harm. They only made people feel their own fear more loudly. I will tell you what the elders of Euphoma never understood. The child who speaks to what others cannot see is not a threat. She is a door. She stands between the living and those who came before, keeping it open just enough for love to pass through. Old Papa ease. Oriva did not call death to him. She told him, in a language older than this village's name, that he was not forgotten, that those who went before were waiting. He cried because it was the kindest thing anyone had said to him in years. The ancestor who chose Oriva chose her like you choose a trusted lamp, because she would not drop it. The village drove away the very thing it needed. Odion and Nkemchi raised their daughter in Wari, and she grew up strange and kind and whole. There is a saying the elders forgot: the child who speaks to the unseen is not lost. She is the one who knows the way.